It started with a phone ringing in the middle of the night. No caller ID, no voice on the other end, just breathing. Slow, controlled, intentional. Within days, the person who received that call was dead. At first, police called it coincidence. Then the phone rang again in another city. Different victim. Same time, same silence. By the third call, investigators realized something terrifying. The calls were not random, they were warnings. And whoever was making them already knew how each victim would die. Families remembered the detail that haunted them the most. Their loved ones mentioned the call casually hours before disappearing, as if it meant nothing, as if it was just another wrong number in the night. But the pattern kept growing. Different states, different lives. Same call, same outcome, no recordings existed. No phone company could trace it, and no one could explain how the caller always knew. What police would uncover later would force them to question whether this was a killer hiding in the shadows or something far more calculated, watching from inside the system itself. It began with a phone call just after midnight. The line was silent at first, only static and faint breathing that sounded deliberate, measured, as if someone were waiting for a response that never came. Then a voice spoke low, calm, and precise. It gave a location and a time and nothing more. The call ended as suddenly as it began, leaving an uneasy tension lingering in the room. At the time, no one thought much of it because nothing had happened yet, but this call would later be remembered as the moment everything started to unravel. Jason Reynolds was 29 and worked as an IT technician in a small suburban town in the Midwest. He lived alone in a tidy apartment on the third floor of a quiet complex surrounded by trimmed lawns and empty streets at night. His life was orderly. Mornings began with black coffee and a review of emails. Afternoons were filled with troubleshooting networks and server issues at the office. Evenings were quiet, spent reading or occasionally playing video games. He maintained a small circle of friends and spoke regularly to his younger sister who lived in a nearby city. Jason's life was uneventful, but it was predictable in a way that drew attention only when someone wanted to notice. He walked the same route to work each day, drove the same roads, and parked in the same spots. He greeted the same cashier at the convenience store for his morning coffee. To outsiders, Jason seemed careful, cautious, and invisible, a man who avoided risk without needing to. Yet beneath the surface, there were small shifts that made him uneasy. In the months leading up to the first disappearance, Jason began noticing odd details in his surroundings. A black sedan parked for hours on his street, always in a slightly different spot, yet never leaving shadows that moved across empty lots in ways that did not correspond to trees or streetlights. Phones that rang with no caller ID and went dead before anyone could answer. He wrote notes, scribbled times, license plate numbers, and brief observations, but shared nothing with friends or family. He told himself it was paranoia, a trick of long nights and overactive imagination, yet the unease grew. The first disappearance changed everything. Lauren Hayes, a coworker, left the office one evening after finishing a routine project and never returned home. Her car was found 2 days later, abandoned in a remote lot miles from her apartment, clean, locked, undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle, no theft, no witness accounts that could explain what had happened. Police opened a missing person investigation and began interviewing everyone who knew her routines. That's when Jason received another call. This one was different. The voice on the line gave a specific time and a location, details that matched exactly with places Lauren had been just hours before she vanished. Initially, he ignored it, but a creeping sense of dread made him realize that this call was not random. A pattern began to form. Someone was contacting people before crimes occurred, perhaps to observe reactions, perhaps to taunt authorities. The thought was chilling. Investigators began comparing the new disappearance to similar cases over the previous 5 years. Short calls from blocked numbers had preceded every incident. None of the cases had been linked. All victims were young adults, living alone, with predictable routines. Their cars were found abandoned in isolated locations. Phones were missing. Witnesses could not reliably place anyone in the critical moments before disappearance. The meticulous planning suggested a predator who was patient, calculating, and skilled at erasing traces of presence. Jason's life, however ordinary, now became a focal point of fear. He noticed small anomalies that had seemed trivial before. Streetlights flickering in the same pattern each night on his route home. Shadows that appeared in alleys and vanished when looked at directly. A faint tapping at his window that matched no weather or wildlife sounds. He began documenting everything, timing the anomalies, mapping his movements, and imagining the possibility that someone had been watching his every step for months, learning his habits. Even inside his apartment, the sense of intrusion persisted. Objects on shelves seemed slightly displaced. His door was always locked, but sometimes he felt certain it had been opened. He checked the locks repeatedly, inspected windows, and rewired his door sensors. Friends suggested stress and overthinking, but Jason could not shake the sensation that he was being observed. That each step he took in his daily routine was anticipated and noted. The night of Lauren Hayes' disappearance, law enforcement began connecting the dots. Analysts reviewed phone records, traffic camera footage, and witness reports from nearby towns. The same black sedan had been reported at rest areas, grocery store parking lots, and city streets along predictable paths. The vehicle was registered to different names at different times, each false, each temporary. The investigation suggested a level of coordination and foresight that pointed to someone who had been practicing this for years. Jason's own observations started to match the details investigators uncovered. He had seen the same sedan parked at various locations. He had seen figures lingering near his route home. He remembered the first phone call, and then the second. He began to suspect he was being tested, studied, or chosen. Fear became a constant companion, and he realized that the next call might be intended for him personally. The first part of the investigation revealed a web of control and patience. The crimes were not impulsive. They were structured, methodical, and psychological. Each victim fit a profile. Each disappearance followed the same eerie rhythm, and each case left families and communities with a haunting uncertainty. Jason began to understand that survival might depend not on luck but on anticipating the predator's next move. Investigators were left with a single, terrifying question. Who was making these calls, and how did they know exactly what would happen next? The investigation deepened as months passed, and new evidence emerged. Phone records, traffic camera footage, and witness accounts slowly began to align in a pattern that was almost impossible to ignore. Analysts noticed that each disappearance followed a sequence: observation, subtle interference, and then the victim vanishing without a trace. The predator was meticulous, patient, and impossibly calculated. No evidence was left that could be traced back, yet the psychological footprint was unmistakable. Jason continued his careful documentation of everything unusual around him. He noticed patterns in streetlights, how shadows fell in alleys, how certain parked cars always seemed to appear when he was leaving his apartment. The realization that he might be the next target created a constant tension in his life. Every sound, every movement, every phone call became a potential signal. The fear was quiet, subtle, but pervasive, like water gradually filling a room. Police revisited older unsolved disappearances, seeking connections they had overlooked. There were at least a dozen cases over 5 years that shared the same characteristics. Victims alone, predictable routines, brief unexplained phone calls, cars abandoned in secluded areas. In each instance, witnesses remembered seeing figures standing nearby, lingering in ways that seemed calculated, waiting. The absence of struggle in every case suggested the predator had learned how to manipulate without force. Trust, compliance, or intimidation was achieved in ways that left no physical evidence. The retired truck driver's statement was revisited, and investigators realized its significance. The calm exchange he witnessed between Lauren Hayes and the man in the black sedan revealed the predator's method. He could approach, establish subtle control, and lead the victim away without resistance. This confirmed that the disappearances were not random acts of violence, but carefully orchestrated psychological manipulations. Whoever was behind it understood human behavior deeply and exploited it with precision. Jason began mapping the locations mentioned in the calls alongside the previous disappearances. A geographic pattern emerged, forming a network of roads, rest areas, small parking lots, and isolated buildings. The predator did not act in one town alone, but spanned multiple states, following predictable paths. Each call was timed to ensure the victim was in the right place at the right moment. The scope of the control was terrifying, suggesting long-term planning and extensive knowledge of infrastructure, technology, and human behavior. Friends and family members described the victims as careful, conscientious, and largely invisible. They were not the type to attract attention, which made them ideal targets. Investigators began to understand the predator's selection criteria. Predictability was the vulnerability, routine was the trap. Each victim had patterns that could be analyzed, anticipated, and manipulated without physical confrontation. It was a psychological game played across years with devastating precision. Jason noticed subtle changes in his neighborhood. Cars parked in unusual spots, lights that flickered in unnatural sequences, shadows that appeared and disappeared with no source. It was not random. He realized the predator was testing him, observing how he responded to anomalies, how he moved through spaces, how predictable his habits were. He began changing routines, taking different routes, adjusting his schedule, and monitoring every small shift. Awareness became a tool for survival, but it offered no certainty of safety. Investigators began to consider technological possibilities. Could the predator be using advanced tracking, hacked communications, or other tools to anticipate movements? Phone records indicated calls at precise intervals, often seconds long, using rotating blocked numbers. Surveillance cameras captured figures lurking in peripheral views, almost invisible, yet deliberate. Every measure suggested someone highly intelligent and methodical, capable of monitoring multiple targets simultaneously. Psychological analysis of the victims suggested a pattern of compliance and subtle influence. The predator had mastered ways to encourage voluntary cooperation, to lead victims without visible force. Observers and witnesses recalled calm interactions that seemed ordinary at the time but were later recognized as carefully staged encounters. The absence of visible violence made the crimes more chilling because the predator's control was mental, not physical. The emotional impact on families was profound. Each disappearance left loved ones in confusion and fear. They struggled to reconcile the normalcy of the person they knew with the sudden and unexplained absence. Communities began to notice the pattern, and fear spread quietly, eroding the sense of security. Law enforcement felt the pressure of solving crimes without traditional evidence, relying on patterns, witness memories, and subtle clues that suggested a dangerous and intelligent mind at work. Jason understood that he had become part of the unfolding narrative. Awareness was crucial. Every step he took, every interaction he had, every decision about where to go and when, became part of the invisible game. The predator's reach was not just physical, but psychological, stretching into the minds of those being watched. Survival depended on predicting the manipulator's expectations and altering behavior without revealing fear. The scope of the investigation revealed something terrifying. This was not the work of a single impulsive criminal. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign, exploiting the quiet predictability of ordinary lives. Each disappearance was calculated, each step monitored, and each target chosen for their vulnerability and routine. The predator's influence stretched across state lines, making traditional investigative methods almost impossible to succeed without anticipating the psychological strategies employed. As the night deepened, investigators and Jason alike realized the next act in the pattern could occur at any moment. The subtle manipulation, the observations, the calculated patience, it was all part of a sequence no one fully understood yet. Every moment was a potential prelude to disappearance. The pattern was clear, yet the identity of the orchestrator remained a mystery. Each small clue revealed methodical genius and a chilling mastery of human behavior. The question remained, how could someone predict and control human movements so precisely? And more importantly, who would be next in the calculated path of observation, influence, and disappearance? The answers were out there, buried in evidence that was almost invisible, waiting to be uncovered. And Jason realized that understanding the pattern might be the only way to survive. Investigators reopened older cases, digging through files that had long been considered cold. Names, dates, and locations were cross-referenced, and a disturbing pattern emerged. There were dozens of disappearances over the last decade that shared the same subtle characteristics. Individuals alone, following predictable routines, receiving brief cryptic calls from blocked numbers, and vanishing without a trace. Some of the victims were found later, disoriented and silent, while others were never seen again. The similarities suggested a single orchestrator who had been active for years, observing quietly and striking when the conditions were perfect. Jason grew increasingly aware of his surroundings. Even in familiar streets, he noticed things he had overlooked before, lights that seemed to blink in a pattern, figures in parked cars that remained still for long periods, shadows moving at the edges of his vision. Each anomaly felt purposeful, as if someone were testing his reactions, learning how predictable he was. His apartment no longer felt safe. Every knock, every creak in the building, every phone vibration made him tense. He began adjusting his habits, taking alternative routes, leaving at different times, and watching others for signs that they might be part of the same invisible game. The detectives discovered that each phone call contained subtle cues. The brevity of the calls, the timing, and the choice of words all pointed to someone highly skilled at psychological manipulation. The calls seemed almost ritualistic, a controlled form of communication designed to unsettle and establish dominance without being directly threatening. Linguists and behavioral analysts were brought in to study the recordings. They noted the calm precision of the voice, the lack of hesitation, and the subtle way it implied knowledge of the victim's movements. It was a mastery of control through fear, suggestion, and anticipation. As they pieced together the predator's methods, a terrifying conclusion became unavoidable. The orchestrator did not need force or violence to achieve compliance. Observation, patience, and psychological influence were enough. The victims were chosen not for wealth or notoriety, but for their predictability. Ordinary, cautious lives became vulnerable because someone had studied their patterns and learned how to exploit them. Even now, the predator could be monitoring, waiting for the next mistake, the next routine, the next ordinary choice that made someone vulnerable. Jason realized that he had become part of this sequence. He recalled every unusual call, every shadow, every fleeting movement in his peripheral vision. He began to track the black sedan he had seen months before, noting its locations, the times it appeared, and the patterns it followed. He analyzed his own schedule, predicting where the predator might expect him to be, and deliberately varying his actions. The tension was constant, a low hum in his mind that sharpened every sense. Survival depended on awareness, but the predator's control was not broken by caution alone. In the investigation, forensic specialists began re-examining old crime scenes. Minute details that had been dismissed suddenly took on significance. Footprints, tire tracks, discarded objects, and faint traces of DNA were re-evaluated. Analysts realized the predator had an intimate knowledge of the areas used, exploiting blind spots, timing, and environmental features to ensure no one could witness or intervene. Every disappearance was a demonstration of calculated patience and knowledge of human and physical geography alike. Families of the missing were interviewed again. Their grief was compounded by the discovery that these events were connected across dates and years. Each account reinforced the profile of the perpetrator as methodical, manipulative, and patient. Emotional testimonies revealed how victims had been meticulous about safety, careful about routines, and yet completely powerless against a mind that had learned to anticipate every step. The chilling realization was that predictability itself had become a liability. Meanwhile, Jason noticed small changes that reinforced the idea of observation. Cars parked near his apartment had new occupants who seemed to wait without purpose. Streetlights flickered unusually at the same time each night. Shadows appeared in alleys he passed frequently. Even casual interactions with strangers seemed rehearsed, as though someone were testing his attention to detail. Every ordinary event became a potential clue, a threat, or both. The more Jason and investigators uncovered, the clearer the predator's methodology became. The crimes were not chaotic acts of violence. They were orchestrated, psychological performances played out in public spaces without detection. The use of brief calls, blocked numbers, and calculated timing ensured the victims were unaware until it was too late. Observers had no clear evidence to report, leaving investigators reliant on subtle behavioral clues, technological analysis, and increasingly, speculation. As the network of disappearances expanded, the predator's reach and patience became apparent. There was a deliberate pacing to the events, with months sometimes passing between incidents, suggesting a long-term strategy rather than impulsive acts. Each disappearance served as a test of both victims and investigators. Patterns were laid carefully, not just to control outcomes, but also to challenge anyone attempting to understand or intervene. Jason's vigilance became almost obsessive. Every day he scanned his environment, noted potential threats, and adjusted his movements. The predator's influence was pervasive, not through force, but through the possibility of observation, the anticipation of behavior, and the subtle manipulation of choice. Every small anomaly was a signal that someone else was controlling more than just events. They were shaping perception, fear, and expectation. As the night fell over the town once again, the sense of tension thickened. Investigators continued to map locations, study calls, and re-examine old cases. Jason understood that knowledge was both protection and curse. Awareness might help him survive, but it also made the danger tangible, immediate, and relentless. The predator remained unseen, yet profoundly present, a constant shadow in the ordinary world. The chilling truth settled into every thought. Each disappearance, each call, each subtle manipulation was part of a calculated plan. The predator's intelligence, patience, and psychological insight made them almost untouchable. Everyone connected to the victims, including Jason, existed under the shadow of observation, uncertainty, and fear. The question lingered, silent but terrifying. When the next call came, what would it predict, and who would answer? The final breakthrough came from a detail that had been overlooked for years. One of the earliest victims had written a short note in a planner on the day they disappeared. It was not a name or a location, just a time and a single word that meant nothing on its own. When investigators aligned that note with phone metadata and traffic camera records, the meaning became horrifyingly clear. The word referred to a maintenance wing inside an old hospital complex, one that had officially been closed after a series of unexplained patient deaths decades earlier. The hospital wing had been sealed, forgotten by most, but never truly abandoned. City records showed it still had limited power access, restricted keycard permissions, and outdated surveillance systems that no longer transmitted to central networks. Someone had kept it functional just enough to use it. When authorities entered the wing, the air was cold and stale. Dust coated the floor, but footprints were visible beneath it, recent and deliberate. Old hospital beds lined the corridor, some positioned as if patients had been moved only hours earlier. Medical equipment sat unplugged, yet carefully arranged. On one wall, faint writing could be seen beneath layers of peeling paint. Names, dates, times. They were the missing. The realization hit instantly. The hospital wing was not just a location. It was the center of everything. The calls, the disappearances, the psychological manipulation, all led here. The predator had chosen a place associated with death, silence, and authority. A place where people instinctively obeyed instructions without question. Jason recognized it the moment investigators showed him a photograph of the corridor. He had seen it before in his dreams, in flashes during sleepless nights, though he had never consciously known why. The voice on the phone had once mentioned a hospital in passing, disguised as a warning, almost caring in tone. That was the final confirmation. The predator had not been hunting randomly. He had been conducting experiments, observing how fear, isolation, and suggestion could override logic. The victims were brought to the wing voluntarily, guided by carefully crafted calls that implied emergencies, authority, or personal knowledge. Once inside, the hospital itself did the rest. Sound carried strangely there. Lights flickered unpredictably. Corridors twisted in ways that confused perception. Time felt distorted. Victims were disoriented before they ever realized they were trapped. Some were released. Those who broke psychologically but survived physically were let go, their silence guaranteed by fear and disbelief. Others were kept longer, studied, broken completely. Investigators never found a body. What they did find was worse. Audio recordings stored on outdated equipment revealed .com monologues spoken to unseen listeners. The same voice from the calls, explaining behavior, predictability, control. How ordinary people could be guided without force. How fear could be engineered. The predator believed he was proving something. That society relied too heavily on routine. That authority was obeyed blindly. That humans could be controlled without chains or weapons. And then the recordings stopped. No fingerprints. No usable DNA. No sign of recent presence beyond the footprints that vanished into dust-covered exits. It was as if the predator had anticipated discovery and simply stepped away. Jason received one final call that night. The voice did not threaten him. It did not demand anything. It simply acknowledged him. It said he had done well noticing the patterns. That awareness was rare. That survival often depended on curiosity rather than courage. Then the line went dead. The hospital wing was sealed again, this time permanently. Concrete barriers replaced doors. Records were classified. The case was officially closed under the label of unresolved disappearances connected to a single unidentified suspect. But Jason knew the truth was unfinished. Weeks later, news reports surfaced from another state. A brief segment about missing individuals, similar routines, similar calls, different city. The predator had not vanished. He had evolved. The final lesson was not about the killer, or the place, or the victims. It was about predictability, about how icily normal life could be studied, mapped, and controlled by someone patient enough to watch. Every unanswered call, every routine followed without thought, every instruction obeyed without question. The danger was never the sealed hospital wing. The danger was how easily people walked into it.